Brilliant. Thanks, Luke. And yeah, very, very happy to be here and looking forward to the rest of the presentations and the discussion. So maybe just to start off highlighting what I am not talking about. So I'm not talking about our research on the impacts of LTNs, of which we've done quite a bit now in relation to London. What I'm going to be talking about specifically is spatial equity and looking at where LTNs are placed, which I think is also a really important issue to look at, but obviously not the only one and not the only potential definition of equity as well. So hopefully this will spark some ideas and some discussion around, how we might look at some of these equity issues in different ways, not necessarily spatially. Just an acknowledgement as well. So this work is collaborative work. It stems from work with Acilia Verlinghieri, Megan Sharkey, Irina Itova and Anna Goodman, who are all co-authors with me on this paper, which is called Equity in New Active Travel Infrastructure. You can see a preprint of that at the link below. It's now been accepted by an academic journal with minor amendments, so it should be, fingers crossed, out soon in terms of the peer review process, but in the meantime you can read our submitted version at the link there. So what the study is looking at is low traffic neighbourhoods in London that were introduced during last year, during a 6-month period of last year. And so these low traffic neighbourhoods, these measures have largely been introduced using relatively temporary, low cost, movable measures like the one you can see here, which is in Hackney. So very often it's camera gates, it's bollards, it's stuff that's been put in to create pretty quickly on the ground areas where through motor traffic is substantially reduced or removed. Just to give you a sense of the scale of what we're looking at here. So across London, so we mapped these various low traffic neighbourhoods that went in between March and September 2020, that 6-month period. And we found, so that image there gives you an image of where the various bollards and camera gates and so on are across London. And first of all, we found that the low traffic neighbourhoods associated with these bollards and various measures covered 4% of London residents, or just over 300,000 people. So I think that's probably the first interesting thing to note, is that this is quite a lot of stuff. This is a significant amount of people being covered by these new measures, which does mean that we can start to look at the impacts in terms of injuries and a whole range of other stuff relatively quickly, and that's something we're literally doing at the moment as well. So 300,000 people, 4% of London residents covered in the areas that we've defined as low traffic neighbourhoods in terms of these new bollards and so on going in. But second thing to note, in terms of London's districts, London's 33 boroughs, these measures are distributed quite unevenly across boroughs. So in Hackney, which had the most amount of new low traffic neighbourhoods during this period, 1 in 6 Hackney residents was covered by one of these new low traffic neighbourhoods, or 17%. But at the other hand, there were a third of the districts basically that did nothing, where 0% of people were covered by these new measures, including 10 that didn't build anything and a couple that built some but removed them pretty quickly thereafter. So there's a lot of unevenness. Just something else to mention here, which is that across a range of demographic groups, based on the London Travel Demand Survey data, it looks like around 9 in 10 Londoners live on primarily residential streets, which is a kind of streets that might be LTNable, most LTNable as it were. So, sometimes high streets are included within low traffic neighbourhoods, but more often, certainly in terms of these schemes, it's not been high streets, it's been primarily residential streets. So the point to make here is, I suppose, that potentially there is scope for quite a lot of people to be covered by these measures if they're seen as a good thing to do and something that is rolled out further. So this slide just shows you the LTNs that we drew, probably a point on how we defined these. So as you can imagine, it was quite a lot of work to generate this data set between us. So also like to thank Asa Thomas for being involved in this work of defining where these low traffic neighbourhoods are. So what we're trying to do in terms of the red areas, we're trying to identify the areas from which through motor traffic has been substantially removed. removed. So we're trying to exclude stuff that was already quiet. We're excluding, roads that were not filtered and so on. So this is our definition of low traffic neighbourhoods. It doesn't necessarily always accord with the maps that local authorities drew, but we were trying to be consistent across districts. And as you can imagine, across 33 or even 20 different districts in London, things are defined differently, things are drawn out differently. This image I just wanted to show you is our boundary road. So one of the things that we're looking at, as I'll come on to in a minute, is potentially who lives in areas that are adjacent to boundary roads, which might see some displacement of motor traffic, at least initially, in relation to these new low traffic neighbourhoods. So we've also, in our spatial data set, we've got boundary roads defined. Now, I say boundary roads, they're not necessarily just around the boundary of a low traffic neighbourhood. They're where we think there might be potential displacement. So they might be further away, for instance, in some cases. For instance, if there's a rail line making up one boundary of the low traffic neighbourhood. So what were our research questions here? So we've got basically 3 research questions. I'm mainly going to talk about results for 1 and 3 because I've got limited time, but happy to, in the discussion, talk more about any of them, in fact, or related issues. So firstly, we asked, with respect to key dimensions of equity, so for instance, looking at ethnicity, looking at deprivation, how equitably are LTNs distributed across London? So, this is quite interesting in terms of what we mean by equitably as well, and perhaps this is something that we'll think about further in the discussion. But you could say, for instance, equitably would mean distributed equally across these different groups. Or you could say that, for instance, in relation to deprivation, people who are living in more deprived areas are less likely to have access to private green space, they're less likely to own a car, they're more likely to live in crowded accommodation, and hence potentially, LTNs are more important in those areas, and therefore an equitable distribution would be one that prioritised deprived areas. So this is maybe something for the discussion. And secondly, we asked, are there differences between low traffic neighbourhoods and nearby surrounding areas in relation to these dimensions of equity? So, basically, okay, so there's these LTNs, but the areas that might potentially experience displacement, if displacement happens, are those different? Are those more or less deprived, for instance? And thirdly, we asked, are relationships in relation to one also present within individual districts or boroughs? So to give you an example, we could find that LTNs were concentrated across London in one type of area, but that might not be due to prioritisation in individual districts. It could just be due to the fact that certain districts have implemented LTNs and others haven't, because we know that some boroughs are very affluent, some boroughs are less affluent. So if LTNs were in affluent areas, is that because boroughs were prioritising affluent areas, or because it was the affluent boroughs that had put LTNs in the first place? So I think there's some really interesting questions to dig into here, and I'm just going to be able to sort of, highlight some of the key things, the key questions and so on. But before I go on and do that, I wanted to just show you a few more maps and just give you a feeling of the kind of data that we're working with. So this gives you, this is West London, and gives you an example of some of the data that we're working with at quite a small scale. So the yellow dots here are the new bollards, camera gates, basically modal filter measures to restrict through motor traffic that have been put in place. You can also see that the red areas are then those areas that we've said, okay, these are the areas that we think those measures, those filters and so on have affected. So those red areas are the areas that we're looking at as being the LTNs. And then, as I mentioned, we've drawn these boundary roads, which represent, the roads that if there is displaced motor traffic, that is the possibility, those are roads, are possibly roads that might see that. So here gives you a picture of the spatial units that we're working with. So in green here, we've got output areas, which include several hundred people. So much of the data that we're working with comes from the census and is at output area level. When we're using deprivation stats, that's at lower layer super output area level, which is several grouped together, but we're then breaking that down into output areas, so everything is at the same level. So basically, you can see within these low traffic neighbourhoods, typically they include a number of output areas here. Another data set that we're working with is the buildings layer from Ordnance Survey Master Map. So in pink, you can see the various buildings. And what we're doing there is we're trying to get an estimate for how many people in an output area live within a low traffic neighbourhood, because obviously the output areas and the low traffic neighbourhood boundaries are not necessarily the same. So you might have around half of an output area in a low traffic neighbourhood. So what we're doing with the building area is we're trying to look at what percentage of a building area of the building area within an output area is within a low traffic neighbourhood, and then draw some conclusions about the makeup of the population within that low traffic neighbourhood. What we're also doing is we're able to look at the output areas, the populations that live in those adjacent areas, as I was mentioning. So we've got the boundary roads. We can look at people who live in an adjacent area that touches a boundary road. So to get a measure of, what kind of people live in the areas that might possibly be affected by any traffic displacement. I think I've got one more of these. Which is this one, yes. What we also do for a sensitivity analysis is to compare the people who live 100% within an LTN, in an output area 100% within an LTN, and see if that alters our analysis. So we're doing quite a bit of stuff here in relation to trying to make sure our analysis is robust, because obviously, the spatial units we're working with are not contiguous with the boundaries of low traffic neighbourhoods. And obviously, if you're looking at, boundary roads, those are roads and not areas. So I guess those caveats. Obviously, there's always inaccuracy. There's things that you would like to do but can't. So I'm going to just give you some quick answers and then just go through a few charts that give you a little bit more detail on each of those. So our first research question, I would say that generally across London, low traffic neighbourhoods were generally distributed relatively equitably, and particularly in relation to deprivation or car ownership. So I'll illustrate this in a minute, but in terms of the kind of areas that LTNs were put into, they were put into more deprived areas. They were put into areas with lower levels of car ownership. The second question, are there differences between low traffic neighbourhoods and nearby surrounding areas in relation to those dimensions of equity? Generally, surrounding areas are quite similar demographically to LTN areas. So it's not that LTNs were in, leafy enclaves surrounded by deprived areas. They tended to be relatively similar demographically, and there's more detail on this in the paper. And thirdly, this is a really interesting question, I think. Those relationships in terms of deprivation of car ownership that we saw across London, are those also present within individual boroughs? So this I'm going to come on to again in a minute. So there is large variation between boroughs, which is really interesting and suggests that I think we need to look at spatial equity at these different levels, monitor it, and see why these differences exist. So to go through the results in more detail before I finish. So this is LTN distribution or access by age. So you can see we've got two bars. So the blue bar is the percentage of people in that group living inside a new low traffic neighbourhood, whereas the orange bar is people living within 500 metres of a new modal filter. And I think there's an interesting question there about how we define impacts or potential benefits of LTNs. So living inside the new LTN clearly has one set of potential impacts. But if you live within 500 metres, that's defined in walking distance, by the way, that's not crow fly, of a new modal filter, you could say that potentially you have gained access, there may be other impacts, but potentially you have gained access to a new walking and cycling route, or a new sort of quiet corridor possibly. So we looked at both of these. They tended to be fairly similar in terms of the patterns that we found, although obviously more people are living within 500 metres of a new modal filter than are living actually inside a new low traffic neighbourhood. So in relation to age there, you can see, not really big differences, but people of working age are slightly more likely to be in a new LTN or within 500 metres of a new modal filter. We also looked at ethnicity. So this is quite interesting, and this shows the importance of looking, looking within different groups and so on, and doing a more detailed analysis. Because if we compare white residents of London to Black, Asian and minority ethnic residents of London, the percentage living in new LTNs are very similar, slightly higher for BAME residents. But then when we look by specific group, you see that there are some, quite substantial differences. So Black residents are more likely than white residents of London to live inside a new LTN or near a new modal filter, but Asian residents are less likely. So there's a difference there, and again, it's quite interesting to think about why those differences exist. But certainly overall, white and BAME residents are similarly likely, but there's differences when you compare Black residents to Asian residents. We looked at disability in terms of the census definition of disability, which is around limitations in day-to-day activities. And you can see there's not much difference there. So the different disability-related categories, the percentages living inside a new LTN or within 500 metres of a new modal filter are pretty similar. Where we see the big differences, though, is household car ownership and deprivation. So household car ownership, people who are living in car-free households are substantially more likely than people living in households with one or more cars to be living inside a new LTN or within 500 metres of a new modal filter. So you can see here on the left is the percentages living inside a new LTN, and among people living in car-free households, among car-free households, 5% of those households are living inside a new LTN, compared to around 3% of people living in of households with one or more cars. And you can see a similar picture in terms of the living near a new modal filter. And finally, deprivation, and again, not surprising after that final one, because car ownership and deprivation are quite strongly correlated in that more deprived areas have lower car ownership. So this is telling us that people living in the most deprived areas are more likely than people living in the most affluent areas to be living inside a new LTN or within 500 metres of a new modal filter. So in terms of the most deprived quartile of London areas, 5% of residents are living within a new LTN, compared to 2% in the least deprived areas. However, and this is my final results slide, what's quite interesting is when you look at the picture by different borough. So what this slide is doing is it's breaking down those relationships in terms of ethnicity, in terms of deprivation, and it's looking at an individual borough level in terms of the boroughs that have put in measures. So the red is inner London here, the blue is outer London, and the size of the circle is proportional to the amount of LTNs that have been introduced in terms of the coverage, the residents who are covered by new LTNs. And what you can see is that there's very substantial variation. So at the top right, you've got those boroughs that have disproportionately put their LTNs in areas that are more ethnically diverse and more deprived. So you can see there's a number of boroughs there. On the bottom left, you've got boroughs that have disproportionately put their LTNs in areas that are whiter and less deprived. So, you know, there is an overall, I would say, generally equitable picture, but when you look at an individual borough level, you can see really substantial differences in relationships. And I haven't got time to talk about why, but there are a number of reasons why this might be the case. And hopefully that's something that we will pick up in the discussion, that you can have an overall equitable picture alongside these substantial variations when you look at a district level as opposed to at a regional level. So just some sort of concluding thoughts from the paper, really. So we conclude that we found that the first wave of LTNs has been broadly equitable across London as a whole, and also at the micro level when we look at residents in LTNs, compare them to immediate neighbours who might live near a boundary road. However, there is considerable variation between districts in the extent to which they've introduced LTNs. And, you know, for a start, just to reinforce that, you know, a third of London districts didn't have any implemented at all, but then the ones that did, you know, where they were prioritising in terms of deprivation and ethnicity varied quite a lot. So we think it's kind of important to monitor this and to be able to respond to it, for instance, in terms of future prioritisation, if where these measures have gone in already is considered not to be as equitable as it should be. And I think that's a good point to stop. Thank you.